Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. Sat means truth, Logos means a study or science, Sattology means a science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means a science of fake lie imagination or study of fake lie imagination. The Western academics have worked very hard to declare the entire Vedic literatures as mythological. It started with Max Muller and later on Macaulay, and it is continuing till date. It's in every part of the world, and we see the effects of it even today. The identity of most of the Indians is, if you ask them about them, the first question is asked by the Western academics is, do you have a caste system? And people have become very defensive. And there is no answer to that. Generally, caste is not an Indian word. Is the best answer, to them. I have a very, very special guest today, and he has worked on Sanskrit, and he's going to talk about his book, Vyasa Katha. So without delay, let us welcome Sri Nityanand Misra. Nityanandji, welcome to the show. So in this book, how do you took Vyasadeva as? What is your position on Vyasadeva, or how you described him as?
So, Vyasa, our scriptures describe many Vyasas. Let's first understand what the term Vyasa itself means. There are two words which are used often in contrast, Samasa and Vyasa. Samasa means shortening. For example, we have Samasas, which are compounds in Sanskrit. So, as you mentioned, Sattology, or you would probably say something like, let's say Vyasa Katha itself is a samasa. Vyasasya Katha, Vyasa Katha. So, samasa means shortening. Vyasa is the opposite. Vyasa means broadening, expanding. Our Puranas describe many Vyasas, and Veda Vyasa, who's credited with the Mahabharata, is essentially a Rishi. What's a Rishi? Rishayo Mantradashtra. Rishis are those people who were in a high state of consciousness, and they experienced some truths in their meditation, and then they brought these mantras to the common people. So Vyasa is a Rishi, and that's how I see him. He is a Rishi, he is a Maharshi. He is also one of the avatars of Vishnu, as per our scriptures. So we see him as everything. I personally see him as a Rishi, as an avatar, and the source of everything. Vyasa is somebody who arranged the Veda into Rig Veda, Sama Veda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda. Originally, the Veda was only one, and it was just called Yajur Veda. But as our text described, Vyasa organized the Vedic mantras into different categories. The Rig mantras, the Sama mantras, the Yajush mantras, and the Atharvas. And then he taught these various samhitas to his Shishya. That's what we see in the Bhagavata Purana, in other Puranas. So we can think of Vyasa as a great teacher, a great Rishi, who was so learned that he could organize the Vedic samhitas. He wrote the Mahabharata, the 18 Puranas are credited to him. The Srimad Bhagavat Purana is credited to him. So essentially, there's a very good saying in our culture, which is Vyaso Chishtam Jagatsa, which means everything in the world is the Uchishta of a Vyasa. Uchishta is something which is the leavings of food, which we call Jutha in Hindi. So everything has been everything that we have in our traditional learning has been touched upon by Vyasa, has been taught by Vyasa. So he is one of the greatest rishis of our civilization. That's how it's.
So you mentioned some points about, which is a very debatable point, on there are many Vyasas. So, and you mentioned many Purana. So would you like to throw some light on that? Like which Purana mentions where?
I don't have the references offhand, but the Vyasas are mentioned in our own texts. Like there's a Vyasa in every Manvantara and so on. So just like you have many Manus, you have many Vyasas. And for example, the Vyasa who is credited with the Brahma Sutras, Shankaracharya in his commentary says he's different from the Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa. So in our own culture, people have acknowledged that or said that there have been multiple Vyasas. That's one example. And well, there are others. I don't have the exact references on hand, but yes, I can share them when I have some time to look them up.
One of the things also you mentioned about, maybe I'll go to your book in this Vyasa Katha when you mentioned there. So is this about one who's which Vyasa Katha you're talking about? Ved Vyas or somebody else?
Veda Vyasa, the author of the Mahabharata, and the book title is Vyasa Katha, Fables from the Mahabharata. So all the kathas, all the 51 kathas in my book are from the Mahabharata.
So in this book, when you mention katha, generally the popular meaning of a katha is a folklore in English. Katha, like in English or even in India, when you generally say katha, that means it is just coming from a very folklorish background. So, but when you talk about katha in Sanskrit, where is Sanskrit meaning and not going to the connotation? Katha means a story with proof, a story with some kind of archaeological proof or astronomical proof. So, in what aspect did you cover Vyasa Katha of Mahabharata in 51 chapters?
So
You know that.
I disagree because katha in Sanskrit does not mean a story with a proof, archaeological or astrological proof. No, it does not. The root is katha vakya prabandhe. That is the Paninian root. And vakya means is a sentence. Very simply translated is a sentence. And prabandha is arrangement. So the root itself means to say. Kath means to say. The Hindi term, Hindi verb kehna comes from the same root. So katha is essentially an arrangement of sentences. And if we go to the Amarakosh, which is an authentic Sanskrit dictionary, what does it say? Katha prabandha kalpana. So the two words are very important. The root says katha vakya prabandhe. Katha is a prabandha of vakyas. And Amarakosha says prabandha kalpana katha. It's the kalpana of prabandha. Prabandha is arrangement and kalpana is not imagination, but kalpana is developing something. So any narration, it's a non-translatable, but any narration from a rishi is a katha. It need not have archaeological proof. It need not have astronomical or astrological proof, but it is a traditional narration. The entire Mahabharata is a katha, which was narrated by Vyasa to his Shishyas, which was narrated by Vaishampayana to Janamedaya, and which was narrated by Suta to Shaunak and other rishis, as per the Mahabharata itself. So not only the Mahabharata, the Ramayana is a katha, and all our Puranic texts are organized as dialogues. So these are kathas, essentially narrations, or I don't want to call it stories. That's why I kept the word katha in the title. But these are narrations. That's how katha is to be understood.
There is a big war of narratives going on in India, as well even in the West. The narratives are all over the place, and when we talk about narratives, then narration of one community over another community keeps going on. So in this and within the same culture also, there are different narratives on the or different interpretations on the same stories. So which side is your katha take?
I don't take sides. I present the kathas as they are.
Like you must have used a narration, like for example, so within the, like there are people who negate Vyasdev completely, and there are people who just want to present Vyasdev as per their understanding. So but they all follow a school of thought. So what is your school of thought?
Well, this is the thing. You don't need to have a school of thought, or you don't need to take a side to present to authentically present Vyasa. We have the tools that I use are my knowledge of Sanskrit and the interpretations in the commentaries. For example, the commentary by Nilakant. I've extensively relied on the commentary by Nilakant. And we understand the verses, and I have presented them. So my book has 51 kathas, 51 narrations made by different characters of the Mahabharata. For example, one katha is narrated by Shishupala, one katha is narrated by Bhishma, many kathas are narrated by Bhishma, one katha is even narrated by Duryodhana. And these kathas have a moral learning in them. Most of these kathas have a non-human character. So an animal or a bird or your senses or a direction. And so these are called niti kathas in Hindi. These are called fables in English. And these kathas, I'm not negating Vyasa, nor am I taking the side of Vyasa. I'm just presenting these kathas as they are, as they have been narrated. So I have presented unabridged and faithful translations of these 51 kathas with the prologue, with the epilogue to give ample context to the reader, and with the learnings. What does this katha teach us? These learnings are supplemented with learnings from other texts in Indian literary history, for example, the Mahakavyas, the Ramayana, the Upanishads, other texts, other Puranas. And so the objective is to present these kathas, which are rich in morals, to our children and to adults. So that's my objective. This book is not a narrative book. I'm not creating a narrative. This book is not a right-wing book or a left-wing book. This book is not a book for those who negate Vyasa, or this book is not a book for those who are on the other side. This is a book for everybody. And that's what the Mahabharata is. The Mahabharata is for everybody, whether you criticize it or whether you praise it. There's so much to learn from the Mahabharata. So my objective, I'm not an ideologue. I identify myself first and foremost as a Sanskrit student and a learner, and somebody who can present authentic knowledge which is there in our Sanskrit text to the general audience. Yes, I do have an ideology, but this book does not have an ideological stance or a narrative.
Good answer. So if I ask you another question, another point of it. So when you were researching these stories from Mahabharata, and I've written 2 books on it, and many other people have written on it. Now, when you're analyzing Mahabharata, now, what was Vyasadev's perspective on when you're researching these katha for your book?
What was Vyasadev's perspective on what?
on Mahabharata, like on different characters. Like, give us some insight into your book. Like, what was Vyasadev's perspective when he talked about Karna? What was Vyasadev's perspective when he talked about Duryodhan or anyone else? Just give us a few hints.
Okay, you mentioned Karna. So my book has a katha which is narrated by Shalya to Karna. Now, the katha there is Vyasa's perspective on Karna is there. It's at other places in the Mahabharata. For example, it is clearly mentioned in the Mahabharata that Karna was a willing party to all the conspiracies that Duryodhana hatched with Dushasana and Shakuni, including poisoning Bhima, the Varanavata conspiracy, everything. So the perspective, what to say of perspective? It is a crystal clear description of, we see that in the adjectives used by, not directly by Vyasa, but Vaishampayan, who's narrating the katha that Vyasa had written, and Sauti. So we see all this at other places. My book doesn't have perspectives on characters of Mahabharata. My books has interesting and moral-rich narrations or kathas narrated by different characters in the Mahabharata. So this katha is narrated by Shalya to Karna, which is a very humorous and katha loaded with pregnant with many meanings, which is of the katha of a crow and the swans. Now here the whole idea is that Shalya is continuously demoralizing Karna. So when Karna marches out on the 17th day of the war, he says, I am the greatest warrior and there's nobody equal to me. And then Shalya says, you are no match for Arjuna. And so Karna insults Shalya that you come from a country where everybody is without morals, where the women, where the men, everybody is completely characterless, and insults Karna and Shalya, I'm sorry. And then Shalya, in return, narrates this katha of a crow, or rather the crows and the swans. And it's a very interesting take by Shalya on Karna, because then at the end of the story, when the katha ends, Shalya says, like that crow in the katha, who was proud of having been brought up by a rich merchant, and who challenged the Hamsas to a flight contest. Like that crow, you are no match for Arjun and Krishna. So that is a perspective which comes out in these kathas. But per se, my book does not deal with Vyasa's perspective on each and every character, or even on the characters covered in the book. But whatever comes out in these kathas itself, some kathas are narrations by Rishis, some kathas are narration. Most of the kathas are narrations by Bhishma. So a little bit of perspective comes out here and there. For example, what's Bhishma's perspective on certain things, or what's Yudhishthira's take on certain things. So that does come out.
Mahabharata has inspired so many people across the world. People like people from other cultures, Western cultures. I mean, they have probably not commented on their own religion so much as they have commented on Mahabharata. And so, what do you think? Because to do a research on Mahabharata is like an ocean. You read for years and years and years, and still you know a little bit. It's so vast. So, what is your experience when you're researching on Mahabharata for this book? Like, what did you there's a very famous American poet, Mark Twain. He started reading Mahabharata, but then in the end he says, the home for me is Varanasi. Like somewhere that was a conclusion which he came out with. Very famous American. Now, so what do you take as a message based on your own research? You are one of the few people who do research on Mahabharata. Considering 7.1 billion people, very few people do research on Mahabharata. So what is your perspective on what is the message you learned, or what do you think is special and which you would like to tell to the audience?
Sure. Now, the Mahabharata is an ocean, as you mentioned. And there are some verses, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, or even some verses in the Kathas that I covered. There are some verses which are so cryptic that we read them, and I don't read translation. I read the original Sanskrit. Of course, my book has the translation into English and Hindi. I read the original Sanskrit, and I read the commentary of Nityanand. A tragedy, I would say it's no less than a tragedy. A very unfortunate thing in India is that there are 36 known Sanskrit commentaries on the Mahabharata. There may be many more. 36 are known. They've been talked about in published books. And out of these, only one, which is the Bharata Bhava Deepika by Nityanand, has been published in its entirety. Now, that is a shame for a country for which Mahabharata is living culture. The other commentaries are either published in parts. Well, there is a Laksha Alankara commentary by Vadiraj Tirth that's published. I think that's published in full, or maybe partially. There's a very small commentary by Madhvacharya. It's not on the entire text. The Mahabharata Tatparya Nirnay, that has been published fully, but there's a commentary by Arjuna Misra, which has not been published. Devabodha, not been published. And all these commentaries are lying in the manuscript form in somewhere in India. In fact, I requested a few days ago, I requested the Indian government to at least digitize them and make them freely available. For researchers like us, there are so many verses which you cannot understand without the help of commentary. And these commentaries are written by acharyas who were not only masters of Sanskrit, they had read the Mahabharata, they had first listened to the Mahabharata from their guru, so they learned it by listening. In Indian culture, learning was always by hearing. That's why we have a word called well read in English, but the equivalent word in Sanskrit is not bahupatita. it is Bahushruta, somebody who has heard a lot. These were acharyas who heard these Mahabharata from their guru. They internalized the meaning. They knew Sanskrit thoroughly well. They knew scriptures thoroughly well. At many places in the Mahabharata, we see there's a link to either Ramayana or the Vedas. For example, there's a katha in my book about the fowler and the pigeons, and this katha is narrated by Bhishma to Yudhishthira. And as per this katha, there's a fowler, a hunter, who was protected by a pigeon, a he pigeon and a she pigeon. Now, it's a very touching story, and once you read this katha, one has tears in their eyes. I had tears in my eyes while I was translating some of the parts. In this story, or in this katha, there is a mention that the he pigeon offers his flesh to the hunter. And there is a link to the Ramayana. In the Ramayana, when there's a Sharanagati of Vibhishana, when Vibhishana comes to Rama, then Sri Rama says that we have heard that a pigeon once offered his own flesh to a bird hunter. So how can I leave Vibhishana, being a man, being a human? When a pigeon could protect a refuge seeker, why can I not protect a refuge seeker? Why should I not protect a refuge seeker? So there's a hint in the Ramayana, and the katha is in the Mahabharata. Similarly, there's a katha, which is the Sharanga Kopakana, quite famous, where Agni burns the entire Khandava forest, and only 6 beings are spared. There is Ashwasena, who's the son of Takshaka. There's Maya, the Asura, who built the wonderful Indraprastha palace. And there were 4 bee-eaters. These 4 bee-eaters are said to be the Rishis. Now, the Mahabharata doesn't mention this, but, and this was when I discovered this, it was kind of a eureka moment for me, that there are translations, there are commentaries on it, and none of these commentaries or translations mentions this link with the Rig Veda. There is a sukt in the Rig Veda where the names of the 4 rishis are the names of the 4 bee-eater siblings, the bee-eater fledglings. So there are links with the Vedic text, there are links with the Ramayana, there are links with everything you can think of. As the Mahabharata says, yadi hasti tadanyatra yanne hasti na tat kvachit. So to understand all this through commentaries is very essential. And it's unfortunate that we don't have these commentaries available. As a Mahabharata researcher, I would say if the Indian government starts a project, or if universities collaborate and make these commentaries available, then our understanding of the Mahabharata will be benefited a great deal by leaps and bounds, because many a commentary have insights which one can arrive at only after years of thinking, internalizing, meditating, and deep thinking about what these verses could actually mean.
Expecting any government to do anything is like breaking a head against the wall, whether it's India or any other country. It doesn't matter. In the US and other Western countries also, most of the Bible-based forums are privately owned. And it is the individuals and the corporates who fund this. In India, that culture has to come in. The private has to take some responsibility, private sector, to set up these kind of independent forums. Look at the example of Banaras Hindu University. You're well aware their library. The library is in shambles, even though they store a lot of important documents. And I personally visited them 3-4 years back, and literally I was sad. I couldn't do much, but I was sad over there to see the quality of old manuscripts being kept there.
Maybe you're correct. There are some examples where the Indian government has done things, and I think I should just to bring the other side. There's a website called Vedic Heritage. Mm-hmm. It is hosted by the government of India, and they have an excellent compilation of all the Vedic Samhitas, the audio recordings, and in some cases video recordings also, of all the Vedic Samhitas, the Rig Veda, the Yajurveda, the Samaveda. So they have done something. I won't say they haven't done anything. The IIT Kanpur website. So I talked about both government and the universities. The IIT Kanpur website has hosted so many different commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita that the Gita Super site is my go-to resource for anything on the Bhagavad Gita. They have Hindi commentaries, they have multiple Sanskrit commentaries, English translations, Hindi translations, and even for the Ramayana, at least for the Balakanda, they have hosted 7 Sanskrit commentaries, all digitized, all completely free and very helpful to readers, to researchers. So there are things which maybe, it could be a private-public partnership. Even if it's privately funded, we have to involve the universities, because these manuscripts of all the commentaries or ancient manuscripts which have not been published, they're all in possession of universities. So somewhere universities have to be involved, somewhere government has to be involved. But as you say, the initiative probably needs to come from private persons in their private capacity, and then we may involve the government and the universities to help these things come out.
That's right. That's right. And so, what's the website name? You said vedicheritage.gov.in or something?
Let me just check on my computer. It is yes, it is a Vedic Heritage portal.
Okay.
Vedic and then heritage.gov.in. And it has, the Vedic Samhitas and the 6 Vedangas, Shiksha, Kalpa, Vyakaran, Nirukta, Chanda, etc. And many other works. Very good thing is the audio files are available for the Vedic Samhitas, which, our tradition is a tradition based on hearing and reciting.
I was not aware of it. So thank you for sharing that. And probably I'll also
It's a wonderful site, and I'm happy to share the link. Maybe you can put up a ticker or somewhere in a description in the video that this is the website, which is an excellent resource for people interested in Vedic Samhitas and Vedic heritage.
So coming back to the site, and IIT Kanpur Super site, I think it's a very popular website now. Most of the people refer to it for Gita. But coming back to your book, because that's the main thing we're discussing today. So Vyasa Katha, when we talk about Vyasa Katha, and you already mentioned 51 different stories with a lot of educational lessons to be learned by other people. So your personal choice as an author, which is your most favorite story out of 51? It's difficult to say because author will like everything that they've written. So which is your most favorite one?
That's an unfair question. But okay, I'd share a very short story, and it's a part of the Brahmana Gita, which is the Mahabharata has several Gitas. The Bhagavad Gita is the most famous one. There are several other Gitas like the Anu Gita, the Vyada Gita, the Monkey Gita, and there's a Brahmana Gita. In that Brahmana Gita, a Brahman narrates many kathas to his wife. And one of the shortest and the most insightful kathas is where he says that there is only one friend, there is only one enemy, and it's yourself. Atmaiva Atmano Bandhur Atmaiva Ripuratmana, that's also said. So to drive his point, the Brahman narrates a katha that 4 groups of students went to Prajapati, Brahma, and asked him for knowledge. So these 4 groups were Nagas. You can think of them as snakes, multi-headed snakes or snakes. The Asuras, the negative powers, the Devas, and the Rishis. And they all surrounded him. They all sat surrounding him. And they said, please give us something to learn. Please give us knowledge. And Prajapati just said, Om. That's all he said, Om. And he was silent. The 4 groups of students returned, and they all thought what he may have meant. So now each of these 4 groups of students understood the instruction, which was just one word, Om, differently. The Nagas, the snakes, what they paid attention to, and many of these insights are brought forward by the excellent commentary of Nilakanta. So the Nagas paid attention to Prajapati opening his mouth and closing, Om. So they, by their Shila, by their Swabhava, by their nature, the snakes bite. And when a snake bites, it opens its mouth and then closes. So they said, okay, so he meant we should bite people. So that's how the Nagas understood, and they started biting people. When the Asuras, they saw that Prajapati was saying Om, they said, okay, he was trying to hide something from us. So maybe, deceit, or maybe that's what he meant. So they understood it as per their. The Devas, they said, okay, why did he say Om? We say Om because when we give something, there is dana. So in the Gita also, it is said that yajna dana tapah kriya. So acts of yajna, acts of tapas, or acts of dana. Tasmad omityudahit. Therefore, by saying Om, these acts are done. So Devas said, okay, so he meant dana. So let's give things to what people want. And the Rishis, they saw that Om, Prajapati first spoke and then went silent. So there's a signal for us to silently meditate. So that's how the same instruction was understood by 4 different groups of students differently. Prajapati just said one word, people understood differently, and then they understood it in accordance with their own internal nature. And this is such a beautiful reflection. As I have mentioned in my book, this is based on a similar katha in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where 3 groups of students go to Prajapati and he just says and they understand the Asuras understand it as Daya. So they say, okay, we are very cruel, we should do Daya. The Devas understand it as Dana, and the Rishis understand it as Damana or Indriyadam, controlling their self. So the same instruction, the same teaching is understood differently by different groups. And this applies to the Mahabharata also. The same text is understood so differently by different people. Some people see that it is an epic of the Kuru race or the Pandavas. Some people say, no, it is biased against Duryodhana and Karna. Some people say it's biased against certain communities. Some people say it's biased against women. Some people say, no, it's everything. It's the most beautiful thing, and it has so many beautiful things to say about women or about all communities or about dharma. So everybody understands in their own limited way. It's like the blind man and the elephant. The Mahabharata is not even an elephant. It's probably a blue whale in this context, or it's the Purusha. And we are all groping in the dark, understanding bits and pieces, and then trying to see, oh, this is what the Mahabharata meant. So this story is one of my favorites. Of course, there are many other stories. For example, you spoke about caste. So there's one story about the Kritagnopakhyan, about the Kritagna Gautama. The most despicable character among the stories that I have translated, these 51 kathas, is a Brahman, and his name is Gautama. And he is shown to be such a bad character in this katha narrated by Bhishma. And the good characters, surprisingly, are Rakshasas in this katha, and a baka or a crane. So what people say as Tiryak Yoni, or the Papa Yoni, a term which comes in the Bhagavad Gita also for, which is used in the Mahabharata and which is used in many times in the Indian culture for births of lower consciousness, for example, animals or birds, and so on. And Rakshasas, they are shown as good characters. A Brahman is shown as a bad. Similarly, there's a katha of Matang and the Jenny, the Rishi's son and the Jenny, in which a Jenny, female donkey, says something to Matanga, and then Matanga, who thinks he's a Brahmana, but he turns out to be a Chandala. He goes and he prays and he becomes a Deva. Now, in the Skanda Purana, the same katha comes, but the difference that he becomes, by the grace of Matangeshwara Linga, which is a Shiva Linga in Ujjaina, as per the Skanda Purana, he attains Brahminhood. So all these kathas have so much to offer. We have so much to learn. And the good part about my book is I have only chosen kathas with non-human characters. So they are interesting, and especially for children and young adults, they have a lot for them to learn from.
So thank you for sharing that story and about the Brahman, and you also touched upon the. So now, if I ask you that this was a favorite story, and I have not read your book, I will be very honest with you. I'd like to read it.
It
But
hasn't come out yet. I mean, it's available for pre-order. The book is releasing in 10 days.
okay, and which publication is doing that?
This is Bloomsbury.
Bloomsbury. Okay. So if I ask you the second most important story, this is the most important, which is your favorite. Again, it's a very unfair question to ask as an author because you cannot have preference of one or the other. One information you spoke about on Jativad, or you spoke about the Yoni, and is there any other story on in your book in this 51 collections which you have, which really addresses the current problems of the society?
Uh, well, if we say that the current problems are, like digital addiction, then of course not. But if the current problems are things like conflict
Uh,
or human nature, then these stories or these kathas have a lot to offer. For example, the noble truths and concepts of ahimsa, of dana, of satya, all these, what are the solutions to our current problems? I'm not talking about, political problems or, but let's say human problems, human relationships, or management of people. For example, there's a katha of a jackal and a tiger. So a tiger appoints a jackal as his minister, and then the other ministers conspire. They hatch a conspiracy and they frame the jackal, and then the tiger decides to end his life. The tiger's mother steps in and then she says that you must not trust your ministers. A king should never trust his ministers. And there's so much of knowledge about uh, politics there. How a king should manage his kingdom, his ministers. Uh, there's a katha where a mouse is surrounded by three enemies at once. There's a cat, there's an owl, and there's a mongoose. And how the mouse, who's all alone and not powerful at all, how he uses just his strategy, just his political strategy to deceive all his enemies and to come out on top. So these kind of problems, like situations which require us to think, situations which require us uh, to deal with human behavior, these kind of problems, the solutions are there in our texts and in these kathas. There are moral learnings, and we can always learn from them. So not all the current problems, but a lot of current problems, we have solutions for them in these kathas of Vyasa.
Oftentimes the narrative is spoken that we need to go back to the roots and how colonization has destroyed our identity, and and regularly, Hindus especially are attacked for being something which they are not. Like when Hindus have practically been on the receiving end from most of the sides. So, and there is a big movement also in India amongst the youth when they are waking up and rising to claim their heritage. And you already mentioned one word, and I believe that you work with Sri Rajiv Malhotra ji also on intranslatables, Sanskrit intranslatables. And during that project also, what were the critical words which you thought will come, which cannot be translated? Like dharma is one, cannot be translated into religion. Is everybody knows that now. And so, what are those other words which you have actually maintained in the original sense in your book also, and which have attacked our community in a big way?
Yeah, so if you allow me a moment, let me just open one of the useful appendices that I have in my book. Please give me 1 minute. There are many words which I have tried, which I have retained in their original Sanskrit. Just a minute. For example, punya and papa. Now, I have not translated papa as sin. I have not translated papa as demerit, because these concepts are very different. And I have retained punya as punya, papa as papa. Similarly, there are other words. Please allow me a minute. Yeah, so I think there are tens of words which I have written in the original. For example, there's one word which is, well, just like dharma, even adharma is non-translated. I've interpreted, I've kept it as is. Atithi, Bhagavan, the Indian understanding of Bhagavan and the connotations that this word has. This is a very loaded word, explained in so much depth in our scriptures. But either Lord or God does not capture that essence. So I have retained Bhagavan. I have retained, things like Buddhi, even Buddhi. So we have Manas, Chitta, Buddhi, Ahankar, the Antahakarana Chatushta. And if we say the mind or the intellect, it's not the same. Manas is the Antahakarana which indulges in Sankalpa and Vikalpa. So that faculty which has a Sankalpa, a desire to do something, or a Vikalpa, a desire to do something else, that is Manas as per our sources. Buddhi is Vivechanatmak Shakti, the discriminative faculty. So if we translate Buddhi as a mind, it does not do justice to the discriminative faculty of Buddhi. If we translate it as the discriminative faculty, it appears odd. So I've retained Buddhi as Buddhi. Similarly, Danda. Danda is not punishment. Danda symbolizes something else also. Danda is also the Danda of, when we say the Brahma Danda of Vasishtha in the Ramayana, when Vishwamitra hurls all weapons at Vasishtha. And with just his Brahma Danda, Vasishtha negates everything. Then he says, Ekena Brahma Dandena Sarvastrani Hatani. So the whole verse is very beautiful and very moving. He says, Dhikbalam Kshatriya Balam Brahma Tejo Balam Balam Ekena Brahma Dandena Sarvastrani Hatani. So he says, fie on the power of a Kshatriya. Dhikbalam Kshatriya Balam Brahma Tejo Balam Balam. So there he says, Brahma Tejas is the bal. The Tejas of a Brahma or a Brahmana is a bal. The Tejas is the luster, the tapas that somebody acquires. That is the true power. And with just one Brahma Danda, all my weapons were destroyed. So Danda has that sense also. Of course, it is a means of diplomacy, like along with Sama, Danda, Bheda, etc. It also means punishment of a king. It also means the power of a king to punish. It also is a staff of a Brahmin, which is it symbolizes, the Brahma Danda symbolizes the power of a Brahmana, and so on. Similarly, Devarshi, Rishi, Mahatma, Himsa. I have kept Himsa as Himsa. I have not translated it as violence or even Ahimsa. Because if you read the book by Rajiv Malhotra and Satyanarayana Dasababaji, the book which you're talking about, Sanskrit Non-Translatables, and I have authored the foreword to that book. So there is a very fine distinction between non-violence and ahimsa. So ahimsa also means, the in ahimsa also means alpa, or as less as possible. So is complete ahimsa possible? Well, when we breathe in or breathe out, we kill so many microorganisms. So complete ahimsa is not possible. You see the Jain Munis, the sadhvis and the sadhus, they wear a cloth on their face. They walk bare feet, and still they say it is not possible to be, completely non-violent. So as less as possible. That is ahimsa. And this sense does not come out in non-violence. Similarly, Ishvara, a word like Ishvara, or Jivatma, or even Kala, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, uh, Prabhu, Pitri, Purohita, Rajarshi, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas, Swadhyaya, all these words are non-translative. And I have an appendix at the end to kind of explain them into English. But when I wrote my book, I've used the original words. This is not a problem for the Hindi book because in the Hindi book, I write the word as is. Therefore, it is easier to understand a Sanskrit text through Hindi or Indian languages like Marathi, like Kannada, like Telugu or Bengali, than understanding them through Sanskrit. For example, you go to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. What does the first sutra say? Yogaschitta vritti nirodha. Now, how do I explain it? If somebody asks me what's the explanation in Hindi, I'll say chitta ki vrittiyon ka nirodha yoga hai. Somebody who speaks Hindi will get some sense. But if I translate it into English as the cessation of the perturbances of the mind or the cessation of the tendencies of the mind is yoga, the essence is lost. So this is the reason why I retained as many words as possible in their original Sanskrit. And in Hindi, I've just used the Sanskrit words.
That's a very important thing because most of the Sanskrit words we cannot speak in English. It's difficult to explain to Americans also. But glad you said that. So those of you who are watching must at least begin learning Sanskrit because you are interested in that topic. So at least learn. So the people, one of the things which comes in Indian context is a lot of Farsi and Arabic words are part of the Hindi language, and they are gradually becoming part of every other language. So, as a Sanskritist or Sanskrit purist, I can say, like you want to, very few people like you are there who study Sanskrit. I read Sanskrit directly also. So, but very few people are there who are retained that skill. So what do you think for that Indian languages and who have so much of Farsi words, Persian words, Arabic words part of the mainstream language? Is there any way to reduce those words in terms of supporting more Sanskrit words or more pure Hindi Sanskrit words into that? I mean, Marathi is more closer to Sanskrit than even Hindi to some extent. Telugu is even more closer to Sanskrit than Hindi.
Well, Marathi, yes. Telugu, the difference is because Telugu has also a lot of Tamil origin, old Tamil. So I don't like to use the word Aryan and Dravidian because people understand them as different. But when we say Aryan languages and Dravidian languages, if you just look at the geographical division, the languages of the south are closer to the original, the old Tamil, and languages of the north, east, and west are closer to Sanskrit. So, but when you look at Hindi and Marathi, yes, Marathi is closer to Sanskrit than Hindi. But which Hindi are we talking about? Because Hindi also is of many different shades. There is a Bollywood Hindi, which is very different from the Arya Bhasha, which was the term used for Hindi by Arya Samaj. You pick up any publication of Arya Samaj, including the Satyartha Prakash of Dayananda Saraswati, and all the Arya Samaj work that came in late 19th century, Arya Samaj had a big role in propagating Hindi. Because Dayananda Saraswati was, although I'm not an Arya Samaji, but still Dayananda Saraswati had such a great role in propagating Hindi. He was one of the first Sanskrit scholars who started writing works like Satyartha Prakash in Hindi. And if you read that Hindi, that is very different from the Bollywood Hindi. If you read the Hindi of great Hindi poets, some of the great Hindi poets like Sumitranandan Pant or Jaishankar Prasad or Suryakant Tripathi Nirala or Ramdhari Singh Dinkar or Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, that Hindi is very different from the Bollywood Hindi or the Mumbaiya Hindi or well, we say Avadhi and Braj. Some people say they're different languages, but since Malik Muhammad Jayasi, who wrote the Padmavat, called his language Hindui, and even Amir Khusro called his language Hindavi. I tend to think of them as a language continuum. So if you look at Avadhi works of Rajbhat, they are very different from Bollywood Hindi. If you listen to my Hindi, it's very different from Bollywood Hindi. So in my Hindi, I don't try to go for just pure Sanskrit words, but also the Prakrit words, because Prakrit is such an important part of our culture, along with Sanskrit and Pali, that these languages in ancient times, Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit, were never in opposition to each other. They enriched each other. And a lot of words come in Prakrit. In fact, I have a book on Prakrit grammar where the author cites verses which are written for which for example, there's a famous verse which says that if somebody recites poetry in Sanskrit, in Prakrit, to answer with poetry in Sanskrit is an insult because Prakrit is so close to the heart. So the Prakrit base of Hindi, and that's where the Shorsini Prakrit or the Maharashtri Prakrit from which Marathi comes. This Prakrit base has so many words which we don't use. For example, let's take a very common word for year. Now, a lot of Hindi speakers say saal. Kitne saal ke ho, kitne saal ho gaye. But if you look at a lot of speakers in Uttar Pradesh, they use the word baras. And it is not a Hindu-Muslim thing. I was once listening to a speech made by Azam Khan and the Samajwadi Party leader. And he was speaking about Jayaprada. It was a controversial speech because he made a remark which was very controversial and which was criticized a lot by media. So I heard that speech and he says, 17 baras se. So he's addressing a poll rally in which a lot of listeners are Muslims. He himself is a Muslim, but he says 17 baras se. So baras is a word which comes from barsh, which is a Sanskrit root. Sal is a word which comes from Persian root. So it is not that there are no options. There are options in Prakrit, in the Prakritized forms or the Tadbhav forms, which we should be using. And why I recommend a Sanskrit Prakrit rich Hindi is because not only is that Hindi closer to its root, which is Sanskrit and Prakrit, even Urdu is largely derived from Sanskrit and Prakrit. And over the years, it became more Persianized and Arabicized. If you look at some of the earliest Urdu poets or shairs, as they call them, their language is mostly Sanskrit Prakrit root. But if you look at later poets like even Mirza Ghalib to some extent, or as and when we had the partition, and now if you listen to an Urdu channel, news channel from Pakistan, their Urdu is unintelligible to me for most of the time. And so what I suggest is we need to start speaking in Hindi, which I do and which I suggest people to do, which is closer to Sanskrit and Prakrit. And the benefits are that this kind of Hindi is easily understood by non-Hindi speakers in India. For example, our countrymen from the south or from the west or from the east, when I write in Hindi or when I speak in Hindi, I have many people from the south who comment and they say that we could easily understand because your Hindi is so much so Sanskrit and rich, and it's also Prakrit rich, but it's so Sanskrit rich and it's easy to understand. So if we think of Hindi as a language which is, I call it's a sensitive issue, but I call it the de facto national language. It's not the de jure national language. It's not by law, but just like cricket is the de facto national sport, Hindi is the de facto national language. And if we have to make it more appealing to our fellow countrymen in the south, in the west, in the east, then a Sanskrit and Prakrit rich Hindi, not a Persian Arabic rich Hindi, is the answer. Because we don't have to sell our movies in the Gulf. We are not Bollywood. We don't have to sell our movies in the Gulf or in Pakistan or in Bangladesh that we cater to their language. We are people who are looking at Hindi as a connecting force which can serve as a link language. It already is a link language, and such a strong connecting force, which is rich in Sanskrit and Prakrit, will be easily can be easily understood by non-Hindi speakers in India.
Unfortunately, Bollywood wants to sell their movies everywhere else except India. and they're actually they're actually seeing that nowadays the viewership is going down and down.
But if you see now we are seeing that just like the latest, Pushpa movie or even RRR, we see that even Hindi speakers are loving or Bahubali, they're loving movies from the South. And the thing is, uh, when India was partitioned and we had the early Bollywood, there were many Muslim and Punjabi artists, so it was kind of natural for them to use a language which they were most comfortable with. And that's how it started. But I would say languages do change over time. There was a time when official communications in Marathi in the Middle Ages, before Shivaji Maharaj, official communications in Marathi had 80 to 90% words of Persian and Arabic root. But when Shivaji came, he instituted reforms. He had a Raj Vyavahara Kosh author, which kind of gave all the Sanskrit related equivalent terms of these new terms, Persian and Arabic terms. And over time, over a period of tens of years, this portion of Persian Arabic words in official use in Marathi drastically came down. So it was his vision also, Shivaji Maharaj's vision also, that helped. And so this is a gradual change. We can't change this overnight. But I try to speak in Hindi. When I'm speaking with a primarily Hindi speaking audience, I try to speak as many Prakrit root words or Tadbhav words as possible. When I'm speaking to a pan-Indian audience, I try to include more Sanskrit words. So it also depends on who we are speaking with, who we are trying to connect with. But it is always possible. I remind people of the serial Chanakya, such a hit serial, such a great serial. And Chandra Prakash Dwivedi is Eshna memory. He's a very good friend of mine. I spoke with him just a couple of hours ago. And the Hindi that he brought on Doordarshan, that was revolutionary. So creative works in such languages, speeches, because it's not more than books, speeches, discourses. These in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Hindi is what we can use to gradually motivate more and more Hindi speakers to use Prakrit and Sanskrit equivalents for Persian or Arabic words. For example, Sal and Baras. Everybody understands Baras. If you don't want to use Baras, which is a Tadbha form, you can say Varsh, which is a Sanskrit word and understood anywhere, almost everywhere in India. So these are certain suggestions that I have.
No, great points. Great points. In fact, one of the when the British said that the English was a unifying language, which is a factually incorrect statement, because Sanskrit is a more unifying language. It has more components everywhere else. And you mentioned about the movies.
Not only Sanskrit, allow me to add something here. Even Prakrit was a unifying language. For example, old Indian kingdoms in the south, they had an official known as Bahattar Niyogadhipati, kingdoms in Karnataka and Andhra. Now that Bahattar is a Prakrit word. Sanskrit is Dvisaptati. So even south, they use like Kachehri. So in Bangalore, we have an office which is called Athara Kacheri. None of these are Kannada words. Kachehri is a Prakrit word. Athara is also a Prakrit word. So these are also, think of this. A very good example is the language of the Sikh gurus. What language is that? The 10th Sikh guru was born in Patna. He traveled all over India. He died in Nanded. And of course, the Punjab connection is there. But the language of the Guru Granth Sahib is not entirely Punjabi. Yes, there are some parts of Punjabi, but it's primarily, they call it a khichdi of Braj and Avdhi and Prakrit of those times. So Prakrit, like works of Tulsidas or Surdas, was for a long time was a unifying force. Sanskrit was a unifying force. Tamil has been a unifying force for some parts of the country for some time, and so on. So all these Indian languages have been unifying force, and of course today Hindi is. So that's what I wanted to say.
And one of the things thanks for adding that. One of the things which you also mentioned, and this will be the last point because it's getting late for other people. So one of the things you mentioned was the Prakrit. Now, people, it's Khadi Boli is the same thing. Khadi Boli.
No, Prakrit is a word used for a family of languages, and Prakrits are very old. Like there's also Ashokan Prakrit,
Mhm. Yes.
right from those times. Khadi Boli is a modern dialect of the Hindi language family, from which current day the standard Hindi, the Manak Hindi that we speak, comes from this dialect Khadi Boli, which is also the source of modern day Urdu.
Most of the
And
people are not.
This was the Hindi spoken in and around Delhi and Haryana. That's the Khadi Boli.
Yeah. They also say that beating with sticks is Khadi Boli. It's almost hard as beating with.
Uh, uh, well, I mean, that's a perspective.
So, the last question is coming back to the book again. So, in the book, when you mention all these different stories, and I'm repeating the questions that people get edged into your book, which is Vyasa Katha. So, it's still not come. It's coming from Bloomsbury. Uh, in this through this book, and you like you mentioned, you're just telling the stories, and and
Along with their context and also the insights and the learnings.
and the learnings, which is a very important thing today, is needed because schools don't teach the learnings nowadays. They are into the model of just giving education. So how can the students of English speaking people, English speaking students, and convent schools, and the schools which still carry the colonial mindset, including, I would also name it as Deoband and Barelvi school of thoughts also, because they are also carrying the ideology of the Arabic world. So do you think that this book can appeal to those people also to turn back towards the culture of India through Mahabharata?
Well, I would say the Mahabharata has so many things to offer to everybody. It's like uh, it's like a river, a flowing river. A river is for everybody. It's for animals, it's for birds, it's for people, and all people. A river doesn't discriminate who will drink the water of the river. So similarly, the Mahabharata is a Sarvajana Hitaya. Everybody can learn something from it, including the English-speaking people, including the people from Bareilly School of Thought. Everybody can learn something. There's some things which they will not agree with, but I'm sure there's something for them to learn. The question whether they will turn to this thought is something I don't know. I don't know if that wasn't the even the goal of this book. My goal of the book was to bring this learning to uh, people who are interested in knowing about the Mahabharata, and whether it is successful in any extent for the people that you mentioned, for them to be more, maybe they'll be more interested in knowing about the Indian or the Indic thought process, because essentially the kathas. I have a book by Dr. Tawatekar, which traces the origin of fables or Niti Katha, as we call it in Hindi, to India, even older than Aesop's fables. Now, Aesop's fables are for everybody. The Jatak Kathas are for everybody, although the Kathas have a Buddhist undertone, because the good character is always a Bodhisattva, and then the Jatak Kathas were used as also as a means to impart very Buddhistic learnings. But still, the Jatak Kathas, when we say, oh, the Jatak Kathas, all children can learn something. The Panchtantra and Hitopdesh, even more so. So similarly, the stories of the Mahabharata, the Kathas of Niti Kathas, or the fables of the Mahabharata, have teaching on so many things. It is not just about the Hindu thought, dharma, arth, kama, moksha. It's also about things like Rajaniti, how a king should rule. Now we say The Art of War by Sun Tzu. That's often cited as a text for everybody to learn. There's a Chinese context, but everybody can learn this. So there are aspects which everybody can learn from. And I hope they'll be at least more interested in knowing more than they do about the Mahabharata and the Indian thought process.
Thank you so much, Nityanand Misra ji. And coming back to the last point, you said the art of war by Sun Tzu. Those are very similar to Kanik's instructions to Dhritarashtra. Very similar, exploitative. And I have
I have a katha which was narrated by Kanika to Dhritarashtra. it's
I,
a it's a very it's a very good katha where mongoose
correct.
and a jackal deceives so many other animals, a mongoose, a rat, and a tiger.
Snake,
Yeah,
snake also.
yes. There's
So
not. I don't think there's a snake there.
uh,
There's a tiger. There's a wolf. There's a mongoose, and there's a mouse and a jackal.
it's I've captured in one of my books actually, Yudhishthira the Pranadhana, which is out also. And I've written an exactly opposite version of that in the Making of a Statesman by Narad Muni, which is a different book we have. Thank you so much, Nityanand Mishra ji. It was a pleasure to have you. And I think the audience loved a lot of your answers on Sanskrit part of it, Prakrit, and also they learned something about your book. When it's out, they are going to get it. And for all the viewers who are watching and who will watch on YouTube also, please do comment on it and let us know your feedback. That is more important to us. And also join our 12x debunking mythology courses, which are going online very shortly. Thank you so much. Namaste.